Uh, Actually, this talk I'm going to give now is an update of a talk I gave at the RIPE 69 meeting in London. One of the reasons of giving it again is not just there were some slightly updated statistics, and statistics are an important part of this talk, but to raise awareness of a certain type of problem that right now, or since some time, causes in certain circles a lot of debate. There is not an easy resolution for this. But at least if you're in an enterprise organization, you must be aware, we think, of this type of problem. It's the problem of strict filtering, which is particularly interesting as the guy who is dubbed as the inventor of strict filtering is in the room now. I mean, he's maybe not the inventor, but the one who documented it in the first structured way. And not everybody is happy he did. He apparently, how do you say, täuscht vor? He seems unaffected by me telling this. He's looking at his computer. Okay, you don't mind me every time I give this talk. He's in the room. I do some reference to him. So you don't mind me doing this again, do you? No. Yeah. That man is cool. He's much cooler than I am doing this silly jokes of, oh, it was him all the time. Yeah, let's just get into it. The stuff I'm going to discuss while I'm the presenter is actually, there's a lot of research behind this, which was done by two other guys working for an IT organization, Burda Digital Systems. And so it's I owe a lot of like the credits and stuff to them. The agenda is pretty simple. I lay out a certain type of problem. After that, I lay out how we, which means mostly to the other guys, I did the assembly and I did some like formulating the research question and stuff. How we tackled finding out data about reality and what are these data from reality. And I will provide like a conclusion and some proposition. There is this in RIPE space. The RIPE is officially it's a registry organization, an RIR, which in the first place means their role is to provide internet resources, address allocations, or autonomous system numbers, stuff like this, to serve as a registry for this stuff. They have more roles in the interim. Actually, it's the understanding is that RIPE is a member organization which puts out like policies created by those members, and they have an agenda, like all organizations have an agenda. I will maybe get to this at a later point. In any case, there is a more or less well-known document from RIPE. Their documents are numbered in a certain scheme. For example, there's RIPE 454, which was actually authored by America and Stefan and Jan George. In RIPE 532, which is from the routing working group, which to the best of, you're one of, oh, I shouldn't address him any longer, but you are one of the chairs of the routing working group, aren't you? No. No, you are addressing, yeah, I always get this wrong. But
point to the routing group and say, you sort this out yourself, then I could put away my filters.
Yeah.
And then the result is a bit wishy-washy.
There is this document on like a certain aspect of routing policies, and this document states there are occasional requirements for the advertisement of more specific routes. I will get in a second to what this is. From within an allocation, with a few ISPs currently filtering at a minimum PA allocation within the relevant address ranges, this can cause significant difficulties for networks wishing to deploy IPv6. What does this mean if you're not from provider space? Actually, once figure you are an enterprise organization. And you decide, okay, we want to do IPv6, we need address space. There is two main approaches. One is, let's imagine there is the RIR, the organization responsible for allocating address space in a certain part of the world. I'm not sure if this is going to be a good idea like this. I have the impression it's not. Maybe like this. Where? White stripe. Oh, this is okay. Thanks for this. Now it seems much better. Simple technology. Thank you. Okay. There is a global organization taking care of address space allocation and distribution, and there is the regional organizations, the RIRs, regional internet registries. There's 5 of them, and RIPE is one of those. Now here is an organization, and this organization needs address space. There's 3 main approaches. One is go to your provider, service provider, and actually use a portion of the address space which has been allocated, as is the correct term, like this. Get a piece of this address space and use it for the organization. Second approach is go directly to RIPE. And tell them, oh, I don't want to be dependent on a service provider when it comes to address space. I need my own address space, which then is called so-called provider independent address space, PI address space. In theory, you for the purpose of this talk means an enterprise organization. You can do that. In practice, RIPE doesn't want to handle a number of organizations building cars or whatever, approaching them directly. So in reality, one has to, if one wants to perform this type of procedure, one has to go through a so-called sponsoring LIR. Organizations at this level, the service providers, are called LIRs, local internet registries. To perform this, one has to go through them, do some paperwork, pay some fee to get independent address space. There is a third option, and the third option is actually the one that most organizations that we do currently perform. That is, act as a provider and get address space from RIPE as a provider. And this address space is so-called provider aggregatable address space, and it's called an allocation. So usually providers get allocations from the RIPE, which then they hand out so-called assignments to their customers. There is an exception from this rule, which is this procedure, but most parts of the addresses actually use this provider aggregatable space, which is allocated from RIPE to providers. These types of addresses, or the ranges used for these addresses are different. Right now, this is usually distributed from, I think it's 2A, no, it's Oh, we saw it on the, I think I even, yeah, I think I have a slide on this. Just a second. Maybe not in this one. No, I don't have it in this one. It's a 2A0 something, and I think it might not be correct, but it's not on the recording anyway. It's easy to find out something /12, whereas these addresses are from 2001. I think it's 678/29. This will be important for the later part of the talk, that addresses from this type of procedure can be distinguished from addresses from this type of procedure. And now, the point about this statement is there is a certain expectation that organizations which act on this level, which were considered to be providers, organizations providing network services, in that once they get an allocation, get a piece of address space from this one, once they announce it on a routing level, they announce their full address space and not just parts of that. Announcing the full address allocation is called the aggregate, whereas announcing parts of that is what is called, I think the term is in there, is there what? More specifics. So if you have a chunk of address space, and on the BGP level, you announce the full chunk, you were allocated by the RIR, that's the covering aggregate, whereas announcing just small pieces of that, those are called more specifics. But both terms usually mostly apply to this part of the world. Forget about this for the rest of the talk. Looking closer at this statement, it mentions there might be cases. There might be occasional requirements where it could make sense to announce so-called more specifics. And there might be a few ISPs, whoever they are, which actually filter. For a reason we will lay out in some minutes, which might filter these announcements of more specifics. Actually, unfortunately, sorry for that, Marika, the filter list that Marika had on her slides, the one where I jumped in, which is a very common like filter list for provider space, implements that exact approach, as we will see. So there might be a problem. Let's phrase it for the moment, just something can go wrong. Most of you will not have, given you are not from provider space, not have a clear understanding what can go wrong, but I will lay this out. The question is now, what are these requirements? And is it just a few ISPs filtering such address space announcements, or is that common practice? And what is the impact for organizations actually wanting to deploy IPv6? To understand the problem space, one, it helps to understand the current developments and momentum in this space of registries, and to understand a certain approach which is called strict filtering. First, let's have a look at the what's going on in the address allocation and registry space right now. In the old days, these organizations getting direct allocations from RIPE were supposed to be providers. Organizations transporting network traffic. They had business models which were around like connectivity, traffic transport. They had many customers, the more the better usually. or it depends. But in general, the more customers, the more revenue, the better. And they had networks. The expectation was like networks with several entry points or exit points, depending on your perspective, with a consistent backbone. So like connected to other networks, acting as an entity as a whole on the routing level, and being able, if traffic leaves their network on one side and the return traffic comes in from another side due to internet routing mechanisms, to be able to handle such a situation. Let's call those organizations, for the purpose of the talk, transit LARs. But since some years, as I said, many organizations which are not service providers, which build cars or are chemicals or produce machines or manufacture something, have realized, oh, it makes our life much more easier in a number of perspectives if we approach RIPE for an address space allocation as opposed to going through this procedure. Not least for the reason that here, on that side of the things, you usually get a /48 in IPv6 terms, whereas here you get usually at least a /32. A common practice by RIPE right now is to allocate a /29. So it gives much more flexibility, much more space. You can better distribute those addresses. For a number of reasons, it makes much sense. And all of our customers, all the organizations we work for have undergone this approach. It makes sense to act as a provider. But there is a big caveat, which is the actual topic of the talk, to underline this this developments. This is number of LAR organizations which have received an IPv6 allocation in RIPE. This was I think this was given in Warsaw, so about a year ago. These numbers were published. The interesting thing is, even LARs with IPv6, the added number of those means in 2015 there is many more organizations from these, say, red organizations as have been there in January or June 2013. And this is not because there is many new providers out there. It's even the opposite. The provider space is not an easy market. So there is providers disappearing. But the overall number is higher, which is actually attributed to large enterprise organizations playing the provider game. But there is, as we will see, this expectation. There are certain assumptions as for provider networks, which lead to certain behavior. I'm going to discuss. Anyhow, you might ask, why does some 5K employee organization from automotive, what is their incentive to act as a provider as just doing the green thing? As I mentioned, the green thing is might be tedious, it's paperwork, it doesn't provide much flexibility. And for example, in Deutsche Telekom space, they tell you, you can do that, but the overall cost is 1,600 euros. Whereas the cost for doing this is there is an initial fee of 2K euros and there is a yearly fee of 2K euros. Here it's a /48 for 1,600. And here it's /29 for initial 2K and another 2K. So do the math. And this is even, I have undergone both procedures. This is even easier to do. So there's a strong incentive for enterprise organizations doing this. And what is interesting, I mean, all these enterprise organizations are new members of the RIR. And, well, for an RIR, striving to rent new office space in Amsterdam and to employ people and to have political weight, it's maybe a nice thing. It's better to have 15K members instead of having 5K members, like some years ago. Again, I'm tapping on somebody's feet, but this is like what happens in that space right now. Another thing we should know to understand the topic of this talk is there is an approach which is called strict filtering. This initially described by Gerd some years ago, which essentially goes along the lines. We as providers, to protect our investment in our like router infrastructure, which has limited memory, and it's expensive memory, it's TCAM memory on the core devices. We don't want other providers to clutter our router memory with like more specifics, with a number of small routes. If the other guys are reasonable providers, they have a consistent backbone, and so they can announce a full covering aggregate of their of the address space they have been allocated by RIPE. So essentially, it's about route filtering at transit points along the lines of, hey, if you are not a provider, I expect you to come up with your covering aggregate and not with more specific routes, which is in technical reality is easy to do, as the red space can be identified easily. So if there is a route turning up in a BGP exchange, which is from this space, one can easily say like, oh, this must be a route of at least 32 bit prefix, and not a longer one. As if it's a longer one, it's not a full aggregate, but like a more specific route. That is the thinking of this strict filtering approach, which there's good reasons to do so, essentially along the lines of reasonable use of hardware investment. And there might be an old internet thinking of like keeping the routing tables tidy and clean and small, and have some like hierarchical routing, which means even if one provider has many customers spread somewhere, once there is this transit point to the internet, we don't want those small routes to appear, but to have a hierarchy of large networks, which then go to smaller networks, but these smaller networks are not visible on the internet level. That is the main approach. The thing is, the question that we were asking when we started the research, which is the basis for this talk, was how many providers actually do this so-called strict filtering? Is it many? Is it just a few, as that RIPE 532 document seems to imply? And what is the impact on actual enterprise level IPv6 deployment? And the reason why we were asking this was mainly because I will quickly present two case studies. Both are customers of us. Both have authorized and written that we can use them as examples, as this is a hot topic and it's an important topic. The first one is a media organization. It's a It's a huge organization. That's the only reason why I provide these numbers. This is not like a small shop somewhere in the middle of nowhere, producing wood, whatever. So it's a huge organization, and they were striving to perform a transition to IPv6. Those guys, HBM, they have 3 main data centers and POPs throughout Germany. All with their own network infrastructure, with their own uplink, and so that they are good and experienced like citizens in the internet world. But it's an enterprise organization, and as pretty much every enterprise organization, they have stateful firewalls. And you might already see where this is going. It's a media organization, so for them IPv6 is important. And they started their activities early. Quickly faced the question, does it make, which of those paths actually to take? And they decided to go this route, as pretty much, as I said, all organizations, at least in the space that we work, do. So they got an address space allocation. They became LIR. At the time, this was before RIPE was handing out /29, so they got a /32. And given they have 3 more or less independent data centers and POPs throughout Germany, they split it. This /32 in 4/34s, so from the address plan exercise. So this is what in the terms I earlier introduced is called a more specific. If from one of their POPs they announce a /34 route instead of the /32 of the whole address space, it's called a more specific, and boom, that's exactly what happened. In their Munich data center, there is 2 internet uplinks from one German tier 1 provider. The other is from mostly in Munich, local, like a city provider, but they have a number of customers, so they are well known in the Munich area. And once they started their /34, boom, it was filtered on the uplink. For the exact, apparently the uplink provider had implemented strict filtering. Now they could solve this by a phone call. I mean, they are a customer, and given their size, obviously they are a good customer. So it was like, well, guys, why do you filter our route announcement? And then, yeah, okay, we understand you need this. We will resolve the situation. But still, this left a very bad feeling. Like, okay, now we could solve it by a phone call, as we are the direct customers of this provider. What about the next one in the chain? Where we are not direct customers, where we are the customers of another provider. If they perform strict filtering, we won't be able to reach. We won't be reachable from certain parts of the internet. And as we all know, I mean, it's in enterprise space and in other spaces too. But it's all about business. And their main concern was, what happens if one of our C-level executives passes his summer holiday somewhere in some part of Europe and isn't able to access his or her emails, as some local provider in, say, Budapest or wherever is is actually performing strict filtering. So that didn't exactly leave a good aftertaste. The other case study is Evonik. There is. Oh, he's over there. There's a guy which was involved in this at the IPv6 summit. Evonik is a huge organization. It's a chemical. They have been in LIR since 2005. They even have like a service organization which is a legal entity in itself for providing IT services, as a number of very large organizations actually have. And what they did, they have two main European data centers. Actually, it's Frankfurt and Essen. This is not like NDA covered information. And they started their IPv6 efforts early too, serious efforts back in like 2013, and came up with an address design with going with a global address space only throughout their whole organization. Don't use EULAs. That is their approach, and I'm in pretty much favor of that approach. I think it's a very good approach, as it simplifies things and it avoids this address selection problem to the best possible degree, to have as few addresses as possible. The only thing was, wait a second, chemical industry, they have like ICS systems. They don't want those systems to be reachable from the internet. So how would you prevent that if you have globally reachable addresses throughout your whole organization? There are three main approaches. First is filtering. At every edge, filter a certain, like assign a certain addresses to ICS systems and filter those at all your network borders. Oh, by the way, this is not a very long talk. I will be done like in 15 minutes. Filter those addresses, or on a routing level, it's much smarter than either. Why announce the full address space to the outside world? Just pick some less like /48s for DMZ networks and announce those. You don't want your whole network to be reachable. Another approach which we see commonly discussed is so-called null routing. Identify your ICS networks, assign a certain address space internally to those, and then null route this address space at all your borders. So while you announce the full address space, still once traffic comes in, on the routing level, drop it when entering a network. And they decided for this approach that we call selective announcement. Just announce parts of your networks routing-wise. Probably you can already see where this is going. There are two main carriers, which are both, one is in European tier 1, the other is a very large German carrier. Expected them to announce their full aggregate, as opposed to like just instead of routing-wise announce a /48, announce a /32. Which meant it could happen, traffic leaving from Frankfurt, coming back through Essen, which, I mean, they have stateful firewalls. Everybody has stateful firewalls, which would cause a problem. In that case, it was like somebody with really a clutch, they resolved this. They had an MPLS layer before the firewalls. So on that MPLS layer, they could like route traffic from left to the right, and so from Frankfurt to Essen or the other way. The only problem was on one side, again, I'm in the space of not violating NDAs. On one side there was Cisco ASRs. On the other side there was Cisco 7206 with an NPE G1. And now you have to implement an additional routing layer. They are running OSPF. Gerd might know where this is going. OSPF, VRF aware OSPF, v3. Doing OSPF in a VRF is not fully supported in Cisco space on all platforms. On a 7206, it's not. Which means they had to come up with a clutch doing static routing on one side, in one data center, static routing, which they had to redistribute. And this that's not what you want. But they couldn't replace, like they hadn't budgeted for replacing those 7206s just for their IPv6 transition project. And they hadn't expected these problems. We had like, I mean, they are a customer of us, so we had discussions with them. We said, don't do that. Be very careful. Talk to your providers first and whatever. Actually, in the interim, we have a checklist, which I'm willing to share this, by the way, the checklist, what to ask you for provider. And one of, when doing IPv6, which network properties and stuff to ask for. And this is one high priority question in that questionnaire. But in the end of the day, it meant heavy additional operations effort and a clutchy network configuration, just because those 2 and 3 letter providers didn't accept their /48s. So there is a potential problem. And those of you from enterprise organizations, you must keep this potential problem in mind. The question then that we were asking was, is this just anecdotal evidence? Was it just bad luck that the first 2 customers that we actually, as ENW, that we had in early IPv6 days, like last year and the year before, going to the internet with IPv6 as enterprise organizations, they stumbled into this trap. That's why we were actually looking at routing data, which is made available by RIPE from several years. And actually, we analyzed routing data from 5 major European IXs, Internet Exchange Points. We split them across Europe to have a good geographical distribution, and not to have like phenomena which only apply like to Germany or to some part of Germany, part of Europe. And what we actually did is, excuse me, get all the routes from those internet exchange points. Those are made publicly available by RIPE. It's just routes. It's not like any secret information. It's just stuff you could see with a looking glass also. It's just aggregated. Look just at these spaces and have a look what is the number of prefixes per prefix length that we see. Is it very common that only /32s are actually routing wise visible and used, or is it common that like /48s from this space, more specifics can be seen? And I will quickly cover the results. Looking at the distribution of prefix lengths, and this is given here. One usually receives at least a /32. These can be considered like aggregate routes, whereas everything longer than a 33 can be considered a more specific route. What one can see here over the years, the amount of more specific routes is growing. So it seems more specifics are, at least, they don't have the overall weight like aggregate routes, but still they're growing. There is some more numbers. This is within the space of more specifics. /48 is the most common one, and the other one is /40, for reasons I might lay out later on. All the others are negligible. And then I will skip this, as this one is much more interesting. What is the relationship of aggregate routes, which are the blue ones, and more specific routes, which are the red ones? If we can observe a trend towards more specific routes, it seems that there are a number of providers accepting more specifics, whereas if this was like decreasing, this would give an indication, okay, it's common practice that strict filtering takes place. The main question for us was is strict filtering common practice? As then, many address assignment exercises of organizations have to deal with this. They have to take this into account. They have to adjust their like security concepts and stuff. or have these two cases where I was involved just been a bad luck. And actually, what one can see is there is, in the interim, the number of, or the weight. One has to, this is not absolute numbers, this is weight within the overall space of routes. There is a very strong trend, and this slide is new. I just updated this last week as we have newer numbers right now. There is a much higher growth rate of more specific routes as opposed to aggregate routes. So from that angle, it seems there is a trend toward more specific routes, which from the needs of enterprise spaces, of these ones, like those automotive suppliers with stateful firewalls, splitting their address space, which they have, their address allocation, which they have received from RIPE. From their angle, this is a good like trend. For them, it's they do not necessarily like it, as it means carrying more routes, means having more memory in the routers. And they don't get extra money for this. I mean, there is, as I said, there's legitimate reasons for provider people to perform strict filtering. Obviously, we have a conflict of interest here.
I could point out that enterprise LRs also need to buy routers. So this backfires. For the enterprise LR that just say, oh, I just have these two prefixes, no problem. But with 1 million enterprises out in the world, they all just have two prefixes. In the end, the enterprise has to
Yeah,
the same
which is,
so it's a tragedy of the commons.
yeah, it's in the long term we might have like a tragedy of the commons. Everybody just looking at the own benefit and overseeing that. Just looking at the own benefit destroys the benefit or creates disadvantages for the community as a whole.
And buy that for themselves.
Yeah.
So it's not an easy problem to fix.
Exactly. I will be done like in 5 minutes. The purpose of why I brought this to RIPE was I wanted to create awareness for this type of problem, as we had the impression it's underrated as for the visibility in provider space or in the RIPE community. There is no easy solution. We can just, I mean, we were like, okay, let's have a look. What are the actual numbers? Without having statistical data and actual numbers, most discussions are a bit vague and don't make sense. Funnily enough, after the RIPE presentation, you might recall this. There was in the room there was the main scientist from EPNIC, Geoff Houston, who is a prolific guy when it comes to overall routing, internet routing statistics and developments and stuff. And he a bit bluntly said, well, that problem that you're describing, that's not a problem. The market will solve this. So money will solve this. Once there is enterprise organizations willing to pay whichever commercial relationship with their providers, so the providers are willing to accept whatever types of routes, not to lose the customer. In the end of the day, it will be like distribution, and we will see many more specifics as money makes the world go round.
Yeah, and I would make the point that the whole reason that people are aggregating and why CIDR was created back in the early 90s was because of memory constraints on routers.
Yeah.
Right? And you already have, a lot of networks come over last year, and I looked for a routing table, hit the 512,000 mark. Right? And I mean, I do have the routing tables on 6, but 22,000, and I was surprised how many /28s there are.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I market has shown already that the eye space is clear. And so what we need to do,
Yeah.
and not only the filtering is, I'm on really strict filters, right? What about hijacks? Right, domain hijacks.
Yeah, these filters will not count against.
Yeah.
There's a number of conflicting interests. One is who can have an entry in the global routing table?
Yeah, a routing slot, let's call it. Yeah. Yeah.
And who can have how many routing tables? And the first one is already hard to answer. The second one is even harder. Like, I think we all agree that enterprises above a certain size need to be routing independent from everybody else, so global swap. But 1, 2, 8, 50, unlimited? What happens if one of these make a mistake and just leak out their 60,000 internal 48s? And that's the problem with the 32. There's many 48s. So if you leak them out in the world, many boxes like a 7,200 will just collapse and die. And this is where the original filtering recommendation came from. Like, you can have a /29, there's 8 32s in it, that should be sufficient for most cases. And then sort of like a discussion to find a consensus in the community didn't go anywhere. You should be proper and aggregate, but if you don't, yeah, well, that's okay if there's good reason. This is not very helpful advice, because you still don't know what works and what doesn't.
Yeah.
But from your, I would conclude from your answer, or from your comment, that it would be more beneficial instead of strict routing to limit the number of more someone can start.
Yeah, but how would you do that?
Technically, I don't know how to implement, but
No, it's not.
Then
Not easily.
Then you have the problem that there's providers that care and very strictly check what their customers announce them. So if you have registered an INX object before, the prefix will go through. If you just leak all your internal code, it will be stopped at the provider because the provider said, your documentation doesn't say that you want to announce, so we don't accept it. That's actually what my page says today. Filter your customers according to the appropriate database and not use strict guidelines like the old page did. But of course, certain ideas never die. I'm willing to accept some blame for that. But the problem is, what do you do with ISPs who just don't care, accept anything from their customer, not even checking whether the addresses belong to that customer or belong to somebody else, and transit providers who also don't care. So you're at the level of a national telco that just accepts anything, and you have no lever to actually stop them. That's a huge problem. And I have no answer to that, but it worries me.
Yeah, it's a complicated problem space. I won't go into the like positions and reasons and so on, as this is a huge debate in itself, which has been going on for a long time. I will conclude the talk here with a simple summary that goes like: if you are an enterprise organization which decided for this way of getting an IPv6 address space allocation, you must be aware of the potential problem which could arise from strict filtering. The problem, it's there, it exists. We have the impression that there is, every quarter, when we look at the data, it's less providers doing it. So the problem seems to go away. It seems to go along the lines of Geoff Houston, the market will resolve this. We will see more specifics as the customers demand for this. Still, the interesting thing is, Gerd is cautious here. We have seen both. This is an organization which has apparently stopped strict filtering in the mid of 2014. Until then, they had very few more specifics, probably direct customers of them. And from one day to the other, I mean, we only looked at quarter data. they had lots of more specifics of all types. So they apparently changed their policy. We have another example, unfortunately, from Milan Internet Exchange. I won't give you the AS number. I don't have it in my head anyway. But it doesn't. These guys apparently, look at this, until end of 2014, there was a number of more specifics, and especially a high number of 48s, and they went back. Apparently, this seems to indicate that they apply strict filtering from one day to the other. I have no idea why. But be aware, there might be a problem that must be taken into account. And there is no easy solution. What we strongly recommend is two things to enterprises. First, discuss this with your carriers in advance. Do not run into the situation like Evonik ran into. That they had a certain well-thought-out address concept, and at some point it turned out reality doesn't allow this. Ask them first. Do your homework. This is like a checklist we developed in one of our customer environments. It's our intellectual property. I can share this. Just drop me an email. You will get this. Which asks a number of questions, like not just, okay, dear uplink, you tell us you support IPv6, nice, but tell us about the properties of the service that we will get from you. And here is there is a high priority question. Providers willing to accept IPv6 prefix advertisements from PA space up to /48 without covering aggregate, provided there is a formal requirement which has to be there, the appropriate so-called Route 6 object exists. Give us a yes or no, and it has the highest weight as of this thing. Do this homework, and in general, we recommend, if you can, at the RIPE meeting, I didn't really get to that point as I had limited speaking time there, and there was quite some discussion in the end. We wanted to propose, okay, a compromise between those guys wanting to conserve the router memory and those guys wanting to announce more specifics. A potential compromise could be, well, /40s. And funnily, we see in those latest numbers, we see a growing amount of /40s. It might be this establishes as a kind of compromise. We usually recommend, like for data center networks which get announced, go with a /40 for each data center, as it increases chances that this will get routed smoothly. These might be the to summarize, there's a problem you must be aware of. Try to tackle it in advance by talking to your uplink providers. Once you're an enterprise organization, it won't be that many, at least not for your main uplinks. And maybe going with /40s for important network segments, once you do selective announcements, is more cautious than going with /48s. That is my overall summary and advice. For the moment, thanks for listening, and now we can have a Q&A.
On that, I would actually recommend if you can get along with 8 prefixes, use 32s. And
Yeah.
29 you can have just by asking.
Yeah. The problem is, I mean, in those enterprise organizations, there's a hierarchy of address distribution.
It will not always work.
Yeah, but I mean, going with, if you can, having a /32 as your smallest announcement, which still gives some flexibility once you receive a /29 from RIPE. /32 will probably pretty much everywhere get routed. That's
this is actually one of the reasons why we went to a /29.
yeah,
Because people
to allow this flexibility.
brought up strong arguments for complicated network structures where you just have not one network but 2 networks, and you need to have 2 blocks. And instead of having complicated policies for when, under which conditions can you have a second block, we just said we made the block bigger so you can have the flexibility.
Yeah.
But
problem